parfait. Donc, je vous présente Laura Shackelford, qui est professeure au département d'anglais du Rochester Institute of Technology et qui a récemment été nommée spécialiste Fulbright, chargée d'animer des ateliers transnationaux sur la narration générative et la narration numérique. Ses recherches portent sur les pratiques narratives et littéraires ainsi que sur les transformations qu'elles ont subies en relation avec les sciences émergentes de la cybernétique, de l'information, de la théorie des systèmes et des sciences physiques depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Elle est l'auteure de Tactics of the Human Experimental Techniques in American Fiction et coéditrice de Surreal Entanglements, Essays on Jeff Vandermeer's Fiction. Donc aujourd'hui, le titre de la présentation de Laura est le suivant: Raconter les écosystèmes algorithmiques, une généalogie post-humaniste des limites de la modernité dans Ascension, a novel de Steve Tomasula. Euh, le résumé est assez exhaustif, donc je vais me permettre de vous partager, disons, les deux premières phrases, si ça vous convient, Laura, bien sûr. Donc, dans cette présentation, Laura examinera le roman Ascension de Novel, publié en 2022 par Steve Tomasula, en illustrant comment il fournit une généalogie critique post-humaniste, riche sur le plan conceptuel et inventif sur le plan narratif, de l'informatique depuis la modernité du milieu du 19e siècle jusqu'à son avenir proche, cataclysmique du 21e siècle, alors que ce dernier est confronté à une catastrophe environnementale et à des écosystèmes algorithmiques de plus en plus impénétrables et actifs, influencés par des régimes autoritaires et capitalistes tardifs. Donc, on vous écoute, Laura. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Julie Michelle. So I'll go ahead and start and switch to representations of artificial intelligence and thinking about narrative representations of these. But I think it does connect back to just the question of the state of creativity today that Sylvie was addressing. So the focus of my presentation is Steve Tomasula's Ascension, a novel, and how it stories algorithmic ecosystems and provides a post-humanist genealogy of becoming or being numerous, as I'll describe. Please let me know if I'm speaking too quickly or if you have trouble hearing me. All right, to start, I wanted to cite Beckett's title in his prose narrative, Imagination, Mort, Imaginer. It resonates, I think, today as we confront planetary, material, and conceptual limits of global systems driven by state-sanctioned authoritarianism and imperialism, or clowns, dynastic late capitalist robber barons, increasingly agential AI, and the Anthropocene as a geological force. The author Steve Tomasula quoted Beckett's title in a 1996 essay, and he quoted it as "Imagination dead, imagine." I think intentionally he added a comma to shift emphasis onto the imperative to imagine, even if only to imagine the end. In other words, to confront the limits of human perception, behavior, technological striving, and entangled collective behavior within these radically transforming ecosystems that we only begin to understand. Ascension, a novel, offers, I'll argue, a post-humanist genealogy of the past 3 centuries, but specifically as these drive and inform the algorithmic present and its potential ends. The novel specifically contextualizes AI as algorithmic ecosystems, which is a term that I use just to capture the ecosystemic scope of artificial intelligence amidst broader, longstanding networks of algorithmic technologies that are increasingly integrated into material infrastructures and obviously substantially redirecting water, energy, and minerals globally. Ascension aligns today's algorithmically driven systems with 3 prior disjunctive moments or paradigm shifts or ends in modernity. It insists that AI are not standalone technologies, but enmeshed within economic, political, and ecosystemic networks. So the image on the right is from the novel. It is kind of an image text, lots of visuals, and it's a map combining marine traffic and air traffic on the same map. Just an example of how it kind of brings the ecosystemic and the technological infrastructures together. The novel situates human-scale paradigm shifts within a broader frame of Earth systems science, evolutionary biology, and geological time. And I'll try to illustrate how it takes this concept of ascension and complicates its association with linear progressive narratives of human-driven socio-technological triumph. Um, Ascension's narrative and novelistic engagements with history at multiple more than human scales differentially fold, I argue, the planet's geological time back into world historical time, inhabiting that disjuncture and suggesting how these different scales and experiences of time might inform everyday experiences of life and enable collective action. It offers a valuable strain of ecological posthumanism in the sense that Bergthaler and Horn identify, which they describe as this awareness that the separation of natural and human domains, the green and the gray, quote, was always a dangerous delusion, a denial of humans' primordial connectedness to the earth, which the Anthropocene is now again rendering inescapable, and even an ideological ruse justifying the dispossession and subjugation of the earth's people, human and otherwise, end quote. Um, so I see the value of the novel in that regard, but I also noted when reading it how easily a critical post-humanist perspective on multi-species, ecosystemic, and evolutionary change can feed into a discourse of what Peter Hoff, a geologist, has called the technosphere. He uses this term to describe a new dimension of the Earth system. So you have like the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and now we have a technosphere that, in his view, is driving evolution. It's the new biology, and he positions it as a kind of inevitable evolutionary and geological force that's now surpassing human awareness and interventions. So I'll try to illustrate how the novel um, uh, raises the specter of this technosphere. All right, so the novel really takes on the anthropomorphic bias, what Monica Fluderich describes as the dominant timescales of narrative and teleology of human-driven plots set against a passive natural setting. These classical narrative approaches reinforce human-centric perspectives that can exacerbate today's anthropogenically catalyzed ecological crises. So the novel sees a kind of potential and necessity for narrative and the novel to help respond to these present-day instabilities. The eco-narratologist Aaron James has argued that, quote, the categories and concepts of current narratological models are insufficient for our epic because narrative is changing along with the world in which we tell and receive stories. So Ascension goes out of its way to kind of confront these narrative and imaginative limits now that the Earth system is no longer a stable backdrop to human activities. We can't ignore it. And I'll argue that it develops narrative strategies to prompt encounters between world historical time and geological time and their respective human-centered and planet-centered ways of thinking, according to, those are Dipesh Chakrabarty's terms. All right, so this is the cover of the novel, opens with this otherworldly landscape featuring this impossibly large, and I would argue probably AI-generated dinosaur bird skeleton that's no longer able to fly. I think the first invocation here and association that came to my mind was ascension as this process of human transcendence over material limits through technologically facilitated, spiritually predestined means, a quote, tending upwards or a rise from inferior to superior. These lines on the cover suggest kind of machine vision and the latest AI advancements that I would follow the philosopher Mark Kokelberg in saying are the latest, quote, transcendence machine promising immortality, end quote. And problematically, this idea of ascension is a continuation of Euro-American patriarchal capitalist imaginaries of modernity and settler colonialism and imperialism. So they understand the anthropic, as Donna Haraway describes it, as the one who looks up, the one who is not of the earth, the one whose feet are in the mud, but his eyes are in the sky, bent on transcending human finitude, abstracting and dematerializing human knowledge at the expense of all else, even planet Earth. This is hardly a novel desire at all, and one that, as Haraway notes, has done us dirt in Western cultures. But the first page of the novel shifts to a cosmic summary that I would suggest totally undercuts that anthropocentric understanding of ascension. So the unnamed narrator begins with, "It didn't have to happen this way or at all, the way we say. Now, how it happened, then a catch in the cosmic dust." And then it goes on to describe these millenniums of eating, suffering, breathing, birthing, living, mating, dying, decaying, composting, sprouting, all life playing out, becoming this thin earthen skin. So here I suggest the novel shifts its narrative scale to this planetary and geological scale of deep time and opens up a consideration of the Earth system's multi-species, material, evolutionary, and planetary processes, which have no clear subject, object, or teleological end. This spatio-temporal disjuncture of the cosmic summary introduces a kind of astronomical scale that causes a sudden shift and a distantiation from human temporality, according to Marco Caracolo. He sees this as having ecological value. He's talked about cosmic summaries in other works of fiction, and stressed that the sort of fast pace of the cosmic summary actually leads to a kind of temporal compression and a contemplative mode that makes more than human events accessible to the human imagination. And I think that's precisely what that shift does here in the novel. As the narrator says, it didn't have to happen this way. So this is just one of several ways that the novel flags the sort of radical contingency of this narrative and human knowledge of the Earth system more broadly. So in a very critical post-humanist way, language and narrative are identified as techniques that establish an irreducible constitutive distinction between humans and their exterior milieu. The quote, "pursuit of life by means other than life," end quote, in Bernard Stiegler's sense. The anthropos is sustained, it reminds us, by means outside ourselves and outside life, whether that medial exteriorization is language, daguerreotypes, drawings, DNA, data mining, carbon-based AI, etc. And the images throughout the presentation are all taken from the novel, and I won't have time to talk about it, but it presents kind of an anarchaeology of media and just the value of these different ways of framing the world and understanding and relating to natural processes. So after the cosmic summary, the narrative unfolds across 3 chapters, all set in the capital of Paraguay, Asunción. Chapter 1, transformation, is 1859, post-independence from Spain, right after Darwinism has exploded. Chapter 2, A Little Truth, is set in the 1980s, right as the bioinformatics sciences start to reign. And then chapter 3 brings us to the near future, also a focus on population genetics and gene editing. The polar ice caps have melted. But significantly, the fact that all 3 chapters are set in Asunción, Paraguay, adds another sort of semantic layer and sort of ironic level to Ascension, casting it as a physical setting, a place, and specifically a place where all the characters are very entangled with the specific material living histories there. Again, countering the idea of ascension as human transcendence, also reminding readers of Spanish colonizers' evangelization of indigenous Guarani people using the Catholic promise of earthly transcendence, but as a form of indoctrination on earth, right? Far from transcendental for those who are kind of captured with that promise. So the novel provides a kind of post-humanist genealogy of the present day. Each chapter features a scientist and their team, chronicling their distinct socio-technological, aesthetic, and epistemic knowledges, as these inform their efforts to search back in bioevolutionary and geological time to unearth the evolutionary history of birds, bird lice, and human immunity to viruses spread by birds. Interestingly, the novel's macro structure across these chapters parallels the scientist's interest in lost or dying worlds, seeking to understand our present day by looking back to prior moments of great change in modernity, a genealogical approach to understanding our near future, But interestingly, also adding a third level to our understanding of ascending, which entails, quote, going back in the order of genealogical succession, reversion to an ancestor, or tracing lineage upwards or back in time. And I just found this in a, like, the OED, hidden. So this really reveals, in this way, the novel tries to reveal, in a very Foucaultian sense, the historical and cultural contingency and discontinuities of discursive formations leading us to the 21st century algorithmic ecosystems that are at the center of its chapter 3. And I think tries to point towards alternative paths or that could or might still unfold otherwise. Let's see. I'll just give a quick snapshot of each of the 3 chapters and then try to come to some conclusions. So chapter 1, Transformation, focuses on an American professor of natural history. Around 1859, he's lamenting the intrusion of Darwinian science, photography, laboratory observation. So he's the dinosaur. These are all displacing practices of natural history and their claims to a divine, unchanging, unified truth. You can see on the left, this is a page from that chapter with the notes from his journal. He writes in the middle, so this is a story about nature, but it won't seem that way since I am writing it and you are reading it. And whatever I write won't be it. And whatever you understand won't be what I meant. All life is here, but it has nothing to do with us. Again, this sort of reference to it and the sort of unknowability of nature as it. The professor is searching for the fossils of this gigantic dinosaur like guaraqui or terror bird in the forests of Paraguay to prove that species were continuous. And the chapter is filled with excerpts from the professor's journal, colorful drawings of insects, engravings, geological stratigraphy maps, all pointing towards these spatiotemporally distinct material traces and indexing how central those residual socio-technical, aesthetic, and material practices are to the professor's era and to his understanding of the world, even as they're being rendered obsolete by new techniques. Chapter 2, A Little Truth, is set in 1980s in the same location in Paraguay. It features Jane Korzeniowski, who's coming to terms with the evil of scientific metrics, which make knowledge of the world and ourselves possible. But she's actively resisting emergent bioinformatics sciences. She notes diphtheria, scopteria, how expansive her drawings of insects seemed compared to the strings of genetic letters that biology was starting to turn every animal into. Jane is searching for a prehistoric louse that appears to have been specialized to live on an animal that had reptile skin and feathers, the infamous feathered bird dinosaur, Archaeotorp. I can't say that. So she can establish an evolutionary link between dinosaurs and birds. She's also accompanied by a documentary filmmaker, Arthur, who's trying to capture her search for the world's most consequential bird lice. While he's also mourning the extinction of film in the hands of video and camcorders. All right. Slime mold. Jane's understanding of the Earth system and its bioevolutionary processes really centers on slime mold and its connection to processes of symbiogenesis more generally, which are the processes through which humans and other multicellular organisms emerged out of precisely such coordination between unicellular life forms. So slime molds can function as unicellular life forms, but in times of need, they'll group together and function as a single organism. Jane describes her aquarium of slime mold and, quote, how its stench held the beauty of the earth, generating a bubble-thin atmosphere that made flowers and blue skies and stench and roommates and their arguments possible too. So Jane recognizes this collective, more than human microbiological forces driving planetary life, the multi-species assemblages such as the human lice, birds, and viruses she studies. And a narrator later in the novel really attributes social evolution as a whole to slime mold as the sort of, the microbiological basis of our collective social coming together in times of need and coordinating our activities. All right, so chapter 3, Ascension, brings us to the present day, near future. It returns us to a cosmic perspective once again, so we're kind of shifting back and forth throughout the narrative. We see the Earth from outer space. We see the satellite and assume this is a satellite image. We have a quote from George Oppen's 1968 serial poem of Being Numerous. It reads, "There are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves." And then on the right, a quote from 2001: A Space Odyssey from Hal. Dave, I'm afraid, Dave. And as you can see, there's live web links, and you can actually read the third chapter online as well. So drawing off of the poem's title of Being Numerous, and I have a whole reading of the poem that I won't get into here because it figures throughout the novel. But in chapter 3, the numerousness, the professor associated with divine nature and Jane aligned with the multi-species collectives and slime mold is here, directly tied to computation and the algorithmic systems co-orchestrating the World Wide Web and informatic infrastructures today. As I mentioned, there's a QR code linking readers to this live Ustream, web links to read the chapter entirely online, adding another layer to this concept of ascension in terms of referencing directly our digital networks, GPS satellites, social media. After this cosmic opening page, the chapter shifts back to the human scale and perspective of Gabe, who's a young woman tending a collection of lice, sandflies, and blue-fronted parrots, ducks, geese, and other birds in glass containers in the insectarium she manages in Paraguay. We see that bioinformatics sciences have expanded to the level of population genetics and gene editing, and Gabe's employer, Olympia, with a god complex fitting her name, is the PI of a U.S. defense-funded research project that's drawing on Jane's hypothesis that indigenous Achi people's frequent exposure to parrots and thus to bird lice has given them immunity to avian viruses that are spread by ectoparasites such as fleas and bird lice. So Olympia is planning to genetically engineer lice to bite humans and birds and spread immunity to avian flu. Contemporary algorithmic ecosystems in this present day chapter, are working in concert with capitalist attention economies, surveilling, mining, and monetizing human data at every turn, in league with repressive state power and U.S. neocolonialism and imperialism globally. Olympia's near future Chicago is enmeshed with what Shoshana Zuboff describes as surveillance capitalism, basically a larger algorithmic system allied with specific political and economic projects focused on exploiting nature and human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. I have a quote from another scientist on the team who kind of captures the sense that humans are now being subsumed to this larger surveillance networks. Jack notes that people used to think they didn't share a body, and maybe once that was true. But with people burning coal and mercury going into the ocean, and the fish eating the mercury, and the people eating the fish, and plants carrying human DNA, and everyone breathing the same air, there wasn't even any separation between people and animals, let alone each other. So these networks are really operating a level that's below organisms and more focused on bridging those organisms. Again, so here I wanted to just suggest in this final chapter, if we take this reference to Oppen's poem, just the first stanza, there are a lot more connections, but I suggest that you can read these. There are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves in two different ways. On the one hand, it points to a recognition of this socio-technical imaginary's systemic production of the human world for us as things that we live upon, drawing our attention to how capitalist systems have brought the world as we currently know it and our status as consumers and now commodities into being. Here, numerousness seems to be associated with calculability in a computational sense, which threatens to eradicate organism boundaries in its drive to compute everything. All life, including humans, are treated as material resources for an evolving, all-powerful technosphere. from this perspective, which is, again, Peter Half's description of a new geological process within Earth systems through which, quote, humans have become entrained within the matrix of technology and are now borne along by a supervening dynamic from which they cannot simultaneously escape and survive. As he says, technology is the next biology, so basically taking over the evolutionary process. So that's one kind of reading of that stanza. And then on the other hand, I think the novel points to this alternate reading that there are things we live upon among, and to see them is to know ourselves, suggests that there's a potential for us to engage instead and see the things we live among, i.e., to apprehend the more than human evolving collectives of life within the Earth system and its biogeological time in complex relation to our historical time. From this perspective, to know ourselves as numerous would be to know ourselves as a small part of multi-species assemblages and geological forces we cannot control, but must continue to attempt to apprehend as the novel's scientists and protagonists do. Um, so as I suggested, in this way, Ascension's expanding and contracting narrative acrobatics, oscillating between planetary space-time and the historical scale of characters' individual experience amidst these multi-species assemblages of more than human life, however tiny, by comparison, and then back again to the dynamic scale of evolutionary planetary time, really folds geological and human time into each other. Encourages readers to inhabit this disjuncture between our sense of time and the planetary spacetimes that increasingly intrude upon the former, illustrating the necessity of such efforts past and present. And just to sort of stress, this is another quote from Dipesh Chakrabarty's project, but I think it really aligns with what Ascension seems to be trying to do with its multi-scalar narrative dynamics, which is to connect deep and recorded histories and put geological time and the biological time of evolution in conversation with the time of human history and experience, including telling the story of human empires, of colonial, racial, and gender depression, in tandem with the larger story of how a biological species, Homo sapiens, its technosphere, and the species that co-evolved with or were dependent on Homo sapiens came to dominate without ever taking our eyes off the hollowed human, which continues to negotiate his or her own phenomenological and everyday experience of life, death, and the worlds. And I think that's my last slide. I will stop share there.